Please.
You can go on, sir.
Okay. Good morning, my dear students. Myself, Dr. Snehanshu Adhikari. I am working in Sports Authority of India as a junior scientific officer and in charge. Currently, I am posted in SAI NSEC Kolkata. Today, I'll be taking the topic on the adaptations in the gastrointestinal system for the athletes. So let me begin my slide. Let me start. I have shared my email ID as well as my contact number also. If you have any doubt in that topic, you can either mail me directly for any clarification or query. Now, if we see the systemic physiology, the very primitive creature, when the life has begun billions and billions years ago, in the form of a very simple form of the life, that is the unicellular organism. I have taken the example of amoeba. So this is the very primitive unicellular organism, and this organism has developed its systems a very sophisticated manner, very primitive manner. So whenever for its survival, it requires the energy in the form of ATP. So that energy has to be fulfilled or supplied by the digestion. So whenever there is some nutrients or particles, it will directly move towards it by the it will simply attract towards the chemical substances. This is nothing but the simple form of the chemotaxis movement, and it will form the temporary food pads and it will engulf the particle inside it. This is nothing but the simpler form of the endocytosis, one of the endocytosis. Now it will digest it and it will take the end products of the nutrients, the simpler form, into the cell, and it will metabolize that, and the end products will be simply excreted out. So we can see the simple digestive system has become more and more complex uh, as an uh, as an organ system when it has developed more and more complexity. So the simplest system will be more and more complex. And if you see the respiratory system in this case, directly whenever there is accumulation of carbon dioxide, that will simply diffuse out into the environmental air, and as the oxygen deficit here in the cell, directly oxygen will diffuse inside the cell. So this simpler form of respiration also became a very complex, has gained a complexity when it has gone to the multicellular organism and such a complex system what we have inside our body. So based on that, you have already seen the systemic physiology. In this, we have divided physiology is nothing but the function of the body system, how exactly we are functioning. Each and every systems are functioning. So how exactly I'm talking, for example, how exactly you're able to hear my voice, so how I'm inspiring the air, and how this inspired air is inspired air in the form of oxygen, it is transported across the circulatory system and reaches each and every living cells, and how the metabolite end products from each cells uh, were excreted out from the body, and the carbon dioxide also how it will be eliminated out from the body. So each and every systems are combined together to give a very fulfilled motto, that is the survival of each and every living cells. So systemic physiology, in that we have divided the entire body system into various systemic level, like cardiovascular system means the similar kind of functions function or organally or organs are put clubbed together to define one system. It doesn't mean that when cardiovascular system will function, respiratory system will not function. No, nothing like that. All the systems will function together and very coordinated manner to fulfill the demand, physiological demand of the body. For that, we have divided the entire systemic physiology into cardiovascular system, respiratory system, neuromuscular system, blood and body fluids, then the digestive system, then the excretory system, then endocrine reproductive system, then the central nervous system. So these are my total systemic physiology, and this systemic physiology just we have divided for the sake of our discussion, but inside the body it is nothing like that, as I have just told. When the systemic coordination should be there, each and every system will be linked each other, and they'll work in a very sophisticated manner. Now if we see the sports or exercise physiology, in that case what happens, each and every system will be adapted, each and every system should be adapted. So basically sports physiology is the branch of the physiology, or it is one of the application in which we will discuss the bodily mechanism and to its ultimate limit to which it can withstand the stress during the sports events. For example, if I'll quote a very simple example, a person who is having a simple high fever approaching towards the lethality, when the body metabolism increases just around 100% above the normal. So you can imagine very clearly the extreme high fever when it is just approaching the body metabolism increases just above 100%. The person for the survival of the person will be very much challenging. It might be towards the lethality also. But in case of long distance runners or cross country runners, the body metabolism increases more than 2000% above the normal, but in spite of that the person come back to the normal life absolutely perfect. So that means the systemic adaptation should be very important in case of sports or exercise physiology. With that, I want to go to my systemic adaptations, what I supposed to discuss in today's class. That is the gastrointestinal system, the GI system or the alimentary system. GI tract plays a critical role in the delivering the carbohydrate as well as nutrients and the fluid during the prolonged exercise, means especially the endurance game based exercise where we do the activity for a constant time duration, and in that case the gastrointestinal system also should be very much equipped. More than that, for an elite player, each and every system has to be adapted. Not only that, even many times we don't discuss about the gastrointestinal system, but you need to understand that the systemic adaptation should be there in each and every level, and gastrointestinal system is also not an exception. So for an elite player, GI adaptation is also playing a crucial role. Now look into the adaptations. What do you mean by that, and how exactly this happens? Now many times we talk about adaptations. Always the adaptations means the each and every system should be adapted to tackle the stressful event during the exercise or tremendous body activity. When it is going on, then the system should buffer, system should well equipped to handle this exercise stress. Now whenever we put in terms of stimuli, it is in the exercise, it could be either in the exercise stimuli, or it could be supplementation, nutritional supplementation, or it could be the environmental factor, or it could be the psychological enrichment of the environment. All these together is going to incorporate in my physiological system, that is the cardiovascular, endocrine, immune, and other all the systemic adaptations should occur. And if you look into that much more tuned up manner, in each system you are having the organ. For example, cardiovascular system, we are having the heart, then blood vessels. In respiratory system, we are having the lungs, then the respiratory tracts or the passages, and so forth. So each and every parts of these systems will be adapted. So each and every organs will be adapted. Not only the organ, if you look into further, the organs are nothing but made up of tissues. Like heart is made up of the cardiac tissue. So the tissue will be adapted. Suppose neuromuscular system, you are having the skeletal muscle as a tissue. So neuromuscular adaptation will occur. So at the tissue level also it will be adapted. Not only that, if you go further detail in the tissue, the cell and the receptor will be adapted. So many times we tell that adaptation. It is not a very simple term. If you need to adapt a system, means each and every cell signaling would be altered. So that means the adaptations would first incorporate it in the gene or the influence the DNA, and it will also change the DNA expression, and DNA expression will result in the messenger RNA carrying of this information from the DNA and for the synthesis of different proteins. And these proteins could be either enzyme, this could be either muscle proteins, and the proteins should be synthesized in your body. So many times these protein interaction or protein could be as a cell signaling pathway, as a various aspects. This protein could be helpful in the digestive system also. This protein could be an enzyme also, and we'll see further in detail. So this is my model. Actually, what we call this is the central dogma. So the DNA to the particular portion of the DNA will be transcribed to the messenger RNA, and this messenger RNA will come out from the nucleus. This obviously this DNA is situated inside the nucleus, and this messenger RNA will carry the information of the particular portion of the DNA. It will copy and it will carry that information to the cytoplasm, and over the rough endoplasmic reticulum it will translate. The translation will occur, and this portion of the messenger RNA will incorporate the sequence wise, it will incorporate the amino acids, and it will be a protein, and this amino acid will this protein, nascent protein, will be further processed by the cell. This is how each and every cell they process, they incorporate genetic information into the messenger RNA, and messenger RNA will synthesize the protein. So whenever we talk about adaptations, it is nothing but the expression of the portion of the DNA, and ultimately the formation of the protein synthesis. It could be this protein could be various form, like the vascular endothelial growth factor. This is also one of the protein. So what this protein will do, it will elongate the blood vessels. So new blood vessels will form when this vascular endothelial growth factor as a protein will be in the picture. So this protein also will be synthesized. Vascular endothelial growth factor will be synthesized by the this same clear machinery, by the central dogma. Now coming to the gastrointestinal system. So whatever we eat, it need to get properly digested. Like I have given an example, amoeba. This is a very simpler form of the life. So amoeba will take a very particular, very small particles, but not like us. We are the multicellular organism and very complex. We eat rice, chicken, mutton, vegetable, quite a lot of stuffs. It need to be break down into a simpler form. So it need to break down. When I am talking about breakdown, it need to be physically breakdown, means it will be physically chopped into smaller particles. Not only that, it need to be chemically chopped also, means the chemical digestion also occurs, so that one single cell. So in the bare eye you cannot see the cell, but bare eye you can see the rice, we can see the curry, we can whatever we are eating, we can see the breakfast, but you cannot see the seed in the bare eye. We cannot see the single cell, is it not? So then you can imagine the single cell which is non-visible in the BRI, how it will eat the lunch, dinner, whatever we are eating. So it need to be chopped into that much smaller particles. So that need to be digested. Then only it will be absorbed properly. Okay, so your digestive system has to be well equipped. So digestive system means it is started with the oral cavity and to the anus. It is the tubular structure, and it is obviously, as we are eating very complex things, so it cannot be, this length of the digestive tract cannot be fit into the straight. So that's why this is very much complex. And can you imagine, we are having how much maximum height? Around 5.5 feet, or 6 feet. And but the length of the digestive tract will be around 30 feet long. So how it will be accommodated? It is not a straight tube. So it is inside the abdominal cavity. It has got a very complex structure, so that the entire length can be accommodated inside that very short height. So it is not a very straight tube, obviously. In this diagram, you can see one doctor has put a light and it will be visible. It is not like that. It is just on funny photo I have kept to make your concept very clear. So the gastrointestinal factory, it is very complex. It is very complex. Why it is complex? So you need to chop down the physically chop down. So in the oral cavity, the grinding process will be there. So oral cavity by chewing, by mastication. So entire things will be chopped down into smaller particles. Not only that, this will not be the only sufficient thing. Then from the oral cavity, it will reach the stomach. There also gastric movement also further chop down. Mechanical digestion, that's what we term here. And then the chemical digestion will occur. Then various, you can see here, like in this animation, it is adding up, pouring up the various enzymes, so that it will again further chemically digest. Then ultimately the end product, what is the, it is getting filtered here, and it is coming here into the circulatory system. And ultimately the end products, what are metabolite end products, it will be filtered out, and by urine it will come out. And the roughage, what cannot be digested further or what cannot be absorbed further, that roughage will be accumulated out, and it will be um, drained out by the defecase. So this is the gastrointestinal factory. So it is a factory which is dealing with that foodstuffs, and it is extracting um, the nutrient substance from it, and which can be utilized for the body. So this is the basic things of the gastrointestinal factory, what it is doing. So these entire things are incorporated in my this digestive system or alimentary system. So as I have told, it has started with the oral cavity and ended up with the anus. So this is the length in case of one adult human being, it will be around 30 feet long length of this entire human gastrointestinal tract. So in the oral cavity, you will see that oral cavity, then followed by the pharynx, then the esophagus. Esophagus will be guarded here by the upper esophageal sphincter. Then it will enter into the stomach. Here will be the diaphragm. So it will pour through the diaphragm and enter into the stomach. So and in the just before entering the stomach, here you are having the lower esophageal sphincter, which actually prevent the regurgitation of this gastric juice, which is having a very high concentration of HCl. Our pH is around 2. So you cannot imagine the 1.5 to 2 pH HCl. If you pour in your hand, it will directly burn. So it is having that much concentration. Then how come this highly concentrated HCl is not harmful to your stomach? Because it is having so many physiological mechanism by which it prevent that. It is having the mucus layer, then the bicarbonate also inside the cell that nullify and protect these gastric mucosal epithelial cells from this, dealing with that low level of pH. Anyway, this esophagus doesn't have evolved, doesn't able to tolerate this high acidic pH. So always the lower esophageal sphincter, which is situated here, it is also normally used to be closed, as well as the upper esophageal sphincter. Both used to be closed when we are not eating. So, and this lower esophageal sphincter basically prevent the regurgitation of this gastric juice. Then after stomach, you are having the duodenum. You can see here this is the pylorus of the stomach, pyloric antrum, then pyloric canal. Then it has ended up into the C-shaped duodenum, then jejunum. After the C, this is jejunum, then ileum, then ended up with the ileocecal junction here. Then this portion, you can see, this is nothing but our large intestine. It has started with the colon. This is the ascending colon. This is the transverse colon. Then this is the descending colon. So this is ascending upwards. Then this is the transverse colon, and this is the descending colon. Then the rectum and anal canal, guarded by the anal sphincters. So this is the overview, anatomical, physiological anatomy of this gastrointestinal tract or alimentary tract. Now, in this alimentary tract, you are having many glands also associated with that. Some glands are directly incorporated into the lining of the inside the lumen itself, and some glands are associated with that GI tract. Like you are having the liver. From the liver, the bile which is coming out from the liver and it is getting drained into the second part of the duodenum. And here you are having one more very important organ, that is the pancreas. Pancreas also drain the pancreatic juice into the second part of the duodenum. So you can see here, bile will come by the bile duct, and pancreatic juice also come by the pancreatic duct and drain into the second part of the duodenum. So it is guarded by the again sphincter of Oddi, and there are very sophisticated mechanism is involved for these juices to come here. It is not simply allowed to get wastage. Now the main function of the GI system, as I have discussed, so whatever food we are taking, it will be digested, and the end product of the digestion, which is simpler form, it will be absorbed, and during that process it also need to secrete like exocrine, means the enzymes what are secreted inside the lumen of the GIT, that is also making the chemical digestion. And also motility should be there, gastrointestinal motility. One of the majors is the peristalsis, primary peristalsis, secondary peristalsis, then segmentation. Lot of movements are there depending on the, some movements are very much crucial for each and every organ in the digestive system. For the stomach, there are different types of movement, specialized movement, which are very much helpful for its function. And overall architecture of the alimentary canal, if you want to see the overall architecture from the inner side to the towards the outer side, if you come, the innermost you will get the mucosa. This is the layer of mucosa. This mucosa is consist of innermost epithelial cell layer. Then the lamina propria. Lamina propria is made up of the connective tissue. Here you are having various submucosal glands situated over here. Then the muscularis mucosa. Muscularis mucosa is consist of the very tiny smooth muscle layer. So this entire layer is called the mucosa. From here to here, this is mucosa. Then beneath the mucosa, you are having submucosa. Submucosa is again made up of the connective tissue. Then based on the again different parts of the intestine, there are various immunological functions are also there. Some lymph nodes will be situated here in the submucosa. Then above the submucosa, look at that. This is the muscular layer. This is the muscular layer. And this layer is called muscularis externa. Muscularis externa is again consist of two types of muscle layers. Overall GIT, if you consider, the innermost layer is the circular muscle layer. These are the smooth muscle layer. Circular means they are concentric. They are situated concentric way around that alimentary tract. And longitudinal means they are situated longitudinally like that, longitudinally along the GI tract. So innermost is the circular layer and outermost is the longitudinal layer. In case of stomach, there will be innermost circular and outer longitudinal, but intermediately there will be oblique muscle fibers, which will give the very much powerful contraction in the stomach. Now, here, as I have told, the innermost is the circular, then intermediate oblique and outer longitudinal in case of stomach. Now look at that. This is the animated uh, picture. So here you are having the gastric epithelial cells, and it has always thrown into folds to increase the surface area. To increase the surface area, innermost layer. Now you are having two very important nerve plexuses in the gastrointestinal tract. Beneath the muscularis mucosa and submucosa, in between these two layers, you are having the myenteric plexus and Meissner's plexus. So myenteric plexus and Auerbach's plexus. Myenteric plexus and Auerbach's plexus. Sorry, MP stand for Meissner's plexus and AP stand for Auerbach's plexus. Don't get confused. Meissner's plexus is the submucosal plexus. These are nothing but the nerve plexuses which are very much responsible for the gastrointestinal movement as well as gastrointestinal secretion. Now, if you cut off all the nervous system to the GIT, but then also the gastrointestinal motility will be there. So the peristalsis will go on. That's why gut is called mini brain. So it is having its own nervous system mechanism by which it can control its movement. So as I have told, this is the Meissner's plexus. Meissner's has described it. That's why Meissner's plexus. Another name is submucosal plexus. Another name for the Auerbach's plexus is the myenteric plexus. It is situated in between this circular and oblique muscle layer. That's why it is called myenteric plexus. Auerbach has described it. That's why its name is Auerbach's plexus. So these plexuses are very, very essential and play a crucial role for the gastrointestinal motility. Now, basic electrical rhythms, these are generated by these inherent nerve plexuses, and this is very much prominent in case of stomach. So you can see there will be slow wave of depolarization from -50 to -40. These inherent waves are always going on. Previously, we do believe that some of the pacemaker cells, pacemaker means which can generate the rhythms what we are having in the heart, like AC node you might have heard, which generate the rhythms in the heart, which are called the pacemakers in the heart. Like similarly, it is situated in the gastrointestinal tract also, in the stomach. They're named as interstitial cells of Cajals. So interstitial cells of Cajals, they generate this kind of impulses, and these impulses will propagate across these nerve plexuses, and these are the primary mechanism by which this peristalsis will occur. And over that inherent nerve plexuses, you are having the sympathetic as well as parasympathetic controls to modulate its functionality like secretion as well as movement. Like you are having the gastric contraction, receptive relaxation, different types of gastric movements are there. So this kind of contraction as well as this kind of different types of movement, contractile movement in the stomach, are also happen because of these different inherent nerve plexuses. I'm not going in detail. So gastric emptying and the pyloric pump. Why I am emphasizing gastric emptying? Because the stomach is having almost 1.5 to 2 liters of capacity, which can store the food inside it, and slowly it will release into the duodenum so that it will emulsify the gastric content and it will partially digest it, because stomach has got very few enzymes. You might have already studied one of the proteolytic enzyme, very important proteolytic enzyme is present in the stomach. That is nothing but the pepsin. So it will partially digest the protein, and ultimately a small quantity of the gastric content will be released into the duodenum. Around 2 ml will be released into the duodenum. A very small quantity. Why the small quantity will be released? So that your rest of the intestine can precisely deal with that small amount of the content, so that it can properly admix the enzymes. Different enzymes are there in the intestine. We are having enzymes inside the intestinal juice itself, that is the succus entericus. We are having proteolytic, amylolytic, lipolytic enzymes. Also, very potent enzymes are also secreted from the pancreatic juice. All the types of enzymes are also available in the pancreatic juice. So all these enzymes must be capable enough to handle properly the gastric content what has been released. So very precise regulation is there in the pyloric antrum and pyloric canal. So the gastric factors which facilitates the gastric emptying, like gastric food volume. If the gastric food volume is enormous, if it has, if it is more almost approaching towards the 2 liter, then the gastric emptying might be facilitated. Then the hormone gastrin also helps to loosen the gastro, uh, this pyloric sphincter, which will be helpful for the release of the gastric content. Then the intestinal factor, which is situated in the duodenum, first part of the duodenum, especially the enterogastric reflex. This enterogastric reflex is completely regulated by the osmoreceptors. So few osmoreceptors are situated in the vicinity of the duodenum, first part of the duodenum basically. They will exactly measure the osmolarity of the gastric content. When the osmolarity is very high, it will increase the tone of the pyloric sphincter, so that further gastric content will not be able to come. And you are having the enzymes also like CCK-PZ and secretin. These are the GI hormones basically. These GI hormones, CCK-PZ, cholecystokinin pancreogymin, this enzyme as well as secretin enzyme. So it is having two different stimulus. CCK-PZ will be released into the bloodstream. Cholecystokinin pancreogymin. What is the stimulus for CCK-PZ? It is the partially digested protein and fat what are there in the duodenum that will stimulate CCK-PZ to be released into the bloodstream, and this CCK-PZ will do further action. CCK-PZ will increase the tone of the pyloric pyloric sphincter, and it will minimize the release of the gastric content into the duodenum. Secretin is also another hormone. It is released into the bloodstream in the vicinity of the duodenum, inside the duodenal cavity. When the low pH, when the gastric content will be released, you know that gastric content is having very low pH. That low pH will stimulate secretin to be released, and the secretin also will increase the tone of the pyloric sphincter, so that gastric content will not be able to release. Simultaneously, CCK-PZ will act on the pancreas to release more enzyme-rich pancreatic juice secretion, and secretin will act on the pancreas to release more bicarbonate-rich secretion, so that bicarbonate will buffer, nullify this H plus, and move that pH towards the basic side of almost 7.8 to 8 pH is required for in the small intestine for proper enzymatic action in comparison to the stomach. And this is how the from the oral cavity, when the bolus will come to the stomach, the primary peristalsis movement will occur and it will reach the stomach. Coming to the phases of gastric secretion, there are different phases like cephalic phase, gastric phase, intestinal phase. Cephalic phase, when you have not taken the food, when the thought of food itself will initiate the gastric secretion. Gastric phase, when food will reach the stomach, it will initiate the gastric secretion. Intestinal phase is when the food will reach to the intestine. It may initiate to some extent gastric secretion. So these are the various phases of the gastric secretion. I'm not going into detail on this. Then the gastric motilities, you are having 3 different types of movement like receptive relaxation. So when you are eating food, your stomach will constantly relax. So when the bolus will come to the stomach, it will relax to accommodate the food content up to 1.5 to 2 liter. This is called the receptive relaxation. So very sophisticated nervous regulation is there. As I have told, that is the enteric nervous system, which act as a mini brain that itself decide how this kind of different motilities should occur and when it should occur. Then the mixing and propulsive movement against the closed pyloric sphincter, the stomach will constantly contract from oral to alveolar direction to move forcefully its gastric content against the closed pyloric sphincter. So that will mix and propulsive the gastric content with the gastric juice. Then the hunger contraction, when you are not able to eat, the entire stomach will contract. That is called hunger contraction. So when you are hungry, so it might be painful to some time because of this hunger contraction. So different types of gastric movements are there. I have discussed this. Then coming to the second part of the duodenum. Here in the second part of the duodenum, as I have told, from the liver you are having the bile juice, which is coming by this bile duct. This is right and left hepatic duct, from which from the bile canaliculi the bile juice is coming. Bile juice is mainly consists of bile salt, bile acids, sodium taurocholate, sodium glycocholate. These are the bile salts. Then the bile pigment, that is nothing but the bilirubin, then water and electrolytes. As bile synthesis is a very constant process, and the sphincter of OD, which is girded here in the opening of this bile duct, cone bile duct, as well as pancreatic duct. This is the sphincter of OD. Now this sphincter is normally closed when the chyme is not there in the duodenum. As the bile production is a constant process, so bile is produced constantly, but this bile, as it cannot drain out, so it need to be stored. So exactly gallbladder stored this bile and it will absorb the water. So the bile which is there in the gallbladder, it is more concentrated than the freshly prepared bile. So whenever food stuff will come here, you need more bile to come here, because this bile salts will help emulsifying the fats, as well as it is having bicarbonate also, which will create the alkaline environment in the duodenum. As well as pancreatic juice also will come via this pancreatic duct and will enter into the duodenum. As I have told, the two crucial J hormones, cholecystokinin, pancreazymin, as well as secretin, they play vital role for these secretions. Now we have seen gut is an important organ basically for the endurance athlete, and guts also need to be trained for the conditions in which it will be able to fulfill the requirement. So whenever we are giving extra supplementation, your digestive system must be capable enough to handle these extra supplements, and it need to properly digest and absorb. Then only you will get the uh, help from the supplements as well as from the nutrient whatever you are eating. So a trained runner is able to comfortably tolerate ingestion of carbohydrate as well as electrolyte solution at a rate approximately equal to their sweat rate during their performance of 90 minutes running at around 65% of their VO2 max. Let me clarify that. So what happens, one of the very sophisticated way how exactly endurance runner, as you know, the endurance player are the more challenging player, where in which you are challenging your physiological system to the most stressful event. So in this what happens, your endurance player are taking to the more challenging event. So they are performing more than 90 minutes or so during the running. So definitely during that tremendous activity, there will be tremendous water loss from the body, water as well as electrolyte loss in terms of sweating. So sweating is the one of the uh, visible water loss, and there will be insensible water loss also. So the expired air, the water vapor also will be lost, and insensible water loss also will be through from the skin also. Directly it will be evaporated out. The sweat molecules will be directly evaporated out. So by these terms, there will be tremendous water loss during the maximum workout. So what happens, this during that time you have to be rehydrated also. So many of the endurance player, uh, they do acclimatize, train their gut, their gastrointestinal system. So they take the carbohydrate as well as electrolyte load also, and in spite of that heavy load, they will not be uncomfortable in spite of the. So whenever we have a meal, you might have felt that when your stomach is filled almost 1.5 to 2 liter, you feel uncomfortable. So they won't feel uncomfortable in spite of filling their stomach up to that much. So this will help them to passively reserve that water as well as electrolytes, and that keep on supplying that nutrients as well as electrolytes, water to the exercising skeletal muscle. So training of the gut, what is that? Athletes often underestimate that importance of the gastrointestinal system. But the supply of the exogenous fluid as well as carbohydrate can be critical to the performance, especially during the prolonged exercise. In addition to that, GI symptoms also like bloating, cramping, diarrhea, and vomiting are very common in case of long distance runners or endurance player. Because you know, during the endurance game, when you are doing your maximum performance, your systemic circulation, uh, your non-vital organs, the circulatory system will contract, especially the mesenteric system, the blood supply to the mesentery, means gastrointestinal tract, will contract, and there will be full of this blood circulation to the systemic circulation. So because of that, what happens, many times during your high performance, you might have this kind of GI discomforts. So your GI system also has to be comfortably deal as well as tackle this stressful event. Without a well-functioning GI system, delivery of nutrients will be very much impaired, and it might lead to ranges of GI symptoms which will develop. The intestinal tract is highly adaptable, and it has been suggested that targeted training of the intestinal tract may improve the delivery of the nutrients during exercise. And this kind of training is called training of gut. Also, it has been found that microbiota gut-brain axis, which is playing a crucial role. What is that? not only from the brain, the impulses can modulate the gastrointestinal tract movement and secretion, but also from the gut, there will be direct feedback to the brain, which will make you feel happy. What is that? This is a very recent updates. What we have seen in the large intestine, there will be harvesting of tremendous your enteric microbiota, normal microbial flora like E. coli and Salmonella. Lot of normal microbial floras are there, and these floras are not similar for every person. There will be billion of flora, and we don't know what is this flora to flora interaction as well as flora to our immune system interaction. So many times this interaction will produce lot of chemical substance, interleukins and TNF alpha, and that neurohormonal system will directly give a feedback to the brain and give a uh, proper pleasure sensation. Many times we call that agar आपका GI system is perfect, then you are very happy. So this could be the one of the uh, scientific reason for that. So what happens in your brain? You are having the amygdala, hippocampus, limbic system, which are very much associated with your emotion, learning, memory, and hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is a key structure which is regulating your neurohormonal outflow. So mainly the hypothalamo pituitary adrenal axis, which is very much crucial for the release of cortisol. Cortisol is one of the hormone which is very much helpful for the stressful event. Also in the sports, the cortisol many times has a crucial role, as well as many players they have misused that cortisol in terms of doping. So how this cortisol is helpful actually? This cortisol will tackle you from the stressful event, even in the exercise also. So what happens? This uh, microbiota gut and brain axis will directly influence the cortisol output, and many times this cortisol will be helpful in the sporting activity. And there are a lot of gastrointestinal regulations are there, like hypoxia. When you give the endurance training, it may lead to hypoxemia in your blood, as well as when you give a proper hypoxic training also in the high altitude, normal high altitude training. So what will happen? This high altitude or hypoxia will directly enhance your DNA expression, and it will synthesize the HIF, hypoxic inducing factor 1 and hypoxic inducing factor 2. So these are the intermediate protein which will act as an hypoxic inducing factors. HIF1 and HIF2. This HIF1 and HIF2 directly influence your iron metabolism. It can directly influence your erythropoietin synthesis, and it will directly enhance your erythropoiesis also. So let's elaborate how exactly this hypoxia is modulating this kind of iron metabolism as well as erythropoiesis. Hypoxia will directly influence the HIF and HIF2, and this HIF1 basically will act on the kidney and liver, and to some extent neuro neuroastrocytes also, which are situated in the brain. They will give to the erythropoietin pool. Erythropoietin is one of the hormone which is predominantly synthesized from the liver. To some extent it can be synthesized from the uh, mm, predominantly synthesized from the kidney, and to some extent it can be synthesized from the liver also, and very minimal quantity will come from the brain. These all will give to the erythropoietin pool. This erythropoietin will directly influence the rate of erythropoiesis, means the rate of RBC production. When it will enhance the RBC production, there will be more and more circulating RBC, which will directly enhance the oxygen carrying capacity. And when there will be directly enhancement of oxygen carrying capacity, definitely that is going to reflect my endurance player's ability, as well as it will also reflect in the VO2 max. So what happens? This hypoxia can also act on the liver, and it will downregulate the hepcidin. You know that hepcidin is one of the recently discovered hormone which has a direct role on the iron metabolism. What this hepcidin does, hepcidin basically decreases the iron digestion and absorption. This look into that dietary iron, which is in the ferric state. It will be converted into ferrous first by the duodenal cytochrome B, and this HIF2 will directly upregulate duodenal cytochrome B in B expression, and B quantity will enhance, so it will convert uh, ferric to ferrous form, and this ferrous form only it can be absorbed. Also the GI gastric acidic environment also will facilitate this kind of conversion. And duodenum is the primary site for this iron absorption. This iron will be absorbed into the enterocytes, gastrointestinal epithelial cells, enterocytes, and basically over these cells we are having the DMT, divalent metal transporter. This divalent metal transporter will help this import of this ferrous into the cell, into the enterocytes, and into the enterocytes it will be stored based on the depletion in your body. This iron is one-way substance, so this iron will come into the plasma, and it will be circulated in the blood and go to the different organs. It can be stored to some extent, but more than the requirement it will not be absorbed. That's why iron is called one-way substance. So this iron will be further in the towards the basolateral side of this enterocyte. We are having the FPN, ferroprotein. This ferroprotein will carry this iron, will be transported this iron into the ECF or the plasma, and it will be carried by the transferrin. So HIF1 as well as HIF2 directly influence this uh, enzymes activity, as well as this transferrin uh, concentration also will be increased. When this transferrin concentration will increase, it will carry more and more iron uh, towards the pool where exactly this iron is getting utilized, mainly for the formation of new RBCs. There will be tremendous requirement of this iron for the um, synthesis of hemoglobin. So this hepcidin basically inhibit that ferroprotein, as well as this hepcidin also inhibit the transferrin. So what happens? Hypoxia will directly downregulates the hepcidin concentration in the blood, and by that way, secondarily, it is very much helpful for the iron digestion and absorption, and it will also enhance the rate of the erythropoiesis. That was very recently discovered, which has been explained by the Volker and Hans in the physiology of the renal physiology, Journal of Renal Physiology, 2010. How exactly this erythropoietin is helpful? We know the progenitors, basically the hemocytoblast, adenomoblast, intermediate normoblast, late normoblast, and reticulocyte, and the mature RBC. So these are the stages of the erythropoiesis. So we know that the very early precursors like hemocytoblast, there are two types of hemocytoblast, blast forming unit and colony forming unit of the hemocytoblast. Blast forming unit is the very much precursor. Then from here the colony forming unit of the hemocytoblast will form. Now if you see over these cells, you are having the erythropoietin receptors. So directly erythropoietin will go and bind to these receptors, and what this erythropoietin basically do, it will do the proliferation of these early precursor cells, so that more and more cell division will occur in the early stage, and it will be enormous production of the RBC. This is what it happens in the normal EPO production. You see here, and in this process of the erythropoiesis, normally there will be apoptosis, some of the programmed cell death. So some of the precursors will simply die off during the developmental process itself. So what happens? This happens in normal erythropoietin production. When the erythropoietin production is blunted or decreased, look into that. You are having more number of apoptotic cells, so that your RBC production is further decreased. Look into that. When there will be increased erythropoietin production, what happens? the from one precursors. So many of these apoptotic cells now are no longer is going to die off, so that they can be prevented, and from that there will be enormous production of the RBC. This is how the erythropoietin is exactly increasing the RBC production, and this is directly linked with the, these are the RBCs in this schematic diagram. Now coming to the digestion and absorption, I'll go a bit fast. Coming to the carbohydrate digestion and absorption, what happens? It has been well documented that after digestion of this carbohydrate, it will form the monosaccharide in the small intestine, basically duodenum, ileum, jejunum. So the small intestine is carbohydrate in the monosaccharide form, it will be absorbed. So what happens? It is secondary active transport by SGLT. SGLT is the sodium glucose co-transporter. What happens here? Uh, Primary active transport is situated. This is the epithelial cells in the small intestine. Primary active transport is situated towards the basolateral side, which pumps constantly by cleaving one ATP, 3 sodiums into the ECF from the cell and 2 potassium inside the cell. So it constantly creates the gradient for sodium. So there is always decreased gradient inside the cell for the sodium. So what happens from the lumen? You're having tremendous amount of the sodium because you are having in the food content also you are having that electrolytes, as well as in many of the secretion this sodium is secreted out. Also in many juice like salivary juice, gastric juice, as well as Succus entericus. Now the sodium along with glucose will be co-transported via SGLT1. It has been well documented that in endurance player, the SGLT expression has increased tremendously, and that's how this will be very much helpful for the sodium as well as glucose absorption. When the sodium will be absorbed, as you know, there will be always entry of the water to the aquaporins or the leaky water channels, so that this is how the sodium as well as water also will be absorbed from the intestine. Then you are having is having the GLUT5 that will directly absorb. This is uh, secondary. This is not secondary active transport. This is secondary. This is facilitated transport via which directly fructose can be absorbed. And GLUT2, which are present in the basolateral side, this will be helpful for the glucose transporter. These are also glucose transporter, basically from the cell higher concentration gradient to the via this GLUT2 facilitated transporter, it will enter into the bloodstream. This is how glucose is absorbed. So it is well documented that in case of endurance player, the SGLT expression is tremendously increased, as well as sodium potassium HPS pump number is also increased. Then coming to the fat digestion and absorption, as we all know, the bile salts will emulsify the fat. So the fat molecule larger droplets will now be cleaved into the smaller droplets. So the total surface area at which the lipases will act will increase, and this will further cleaved and emulsified, and fat will be digested via these various lipolytic enzymes. Now, after digestion, this will form the phospholipid as well as triglyceride, and it will be absorbed into the mucosal epithelial cells. And after absorption inside the cell, there will be chylomicron, formation of the chylomicron, and in the center, you will be having the fat soluble vitamins like A, D, E, K, which are very, very essential vitamins, and E is the one of the very important antioxidant, natural antioxidant. These are the fat soluble vitamin that will be absorbed along with that. And looking to the surface area provided by the gastrointestinal modifications, you see that the lamina propria is thrown into many folds, so it will increase the surface area by 10 times if it is stretched uh, from there. It will increase by the 10 times increase of the surface area. And on the top we are having the villi. Look into that, these are the finger like projections. This will also further enhance the surface area. This will also further enhance the surface area by 10 times, and above which you will be having the epithelial cells, which top of which you will be having the microvilli that will increase the surface area by 100 times. So total surface area increase will be tremendously enhanced by this kind of modification. And if you see inside the villi, we'll be having the blood vessels and centrally placed the lacteals. These lacteals will carry the fat chylomicrons into it, through it, and it will directly carry via the cisterna chyli and drain into the circulatory system. And the carbohydrate and proteins after this, after the digestion, they will be absorbed, and that will be carried by this mesenteric circulation, and that will go to the liver. And liver is a checkpoint that how much glucose should be released into the bloodstream. So if it is more, it is stored in the form of glycogen. This how liver is also acting as a checkpoint. So that's what I have just told. The bile droplets will be helpful for the digestion as well as absorption of the fat. Coming to the water absorption will be tremendously in the large intestine. Water absorption will be tremendously in the large intestine, and this water will be absorbed along with the sodium. Water will be absorbed along with the sodium, and large intestine basically releases also mucus. So in the large intestine, we'll be having different types of mineral absorption also will occur, and one of the important vitamin like vitamin K, vitamin B12, they are also synthesized in the large intestine by normal microbial flora. So normal microbial flora, they are very much helpful for us as they are synthesizing some of the vital vitamins like vitamin K, which is very important for the synthesis of certain coagulation factors, and vitamin B12 is very much essential for the nuclear division in the erythropoiesis. So vitamin B12 is also very much essential for the RBC production. So vitamin B12, iron, as we have already seen earlier, that vitamin B12, iron, these are very much helpful for the erythropoiesis. Now these all together will be helpful for the body, and ultimately all together will be beneficial for an athlete. And for vitamin B12 also, the intrinsic factor that is the castle intrinsic factor, which will be secreted by the stomach, and this intrinsic factor will bind with the vitamin B12, and ultimately it will be absorbed in the ileum. By absorption of vitamin D is having a very crucial role for the calcium absorption. Vitamin D can be synthesized to some extent in the presence of ultraviolet ray from the sun. So vitamin D can be synthesized. This is how all the nutrient substances they will be very much beneficial for playing their crucial role in case of an athlete. So athletes must have a well-equipped, well-adapted gastrointestinal system to fulfill the extra physiological demand. Thank you so much for your patient hearing. So if you have any doubt, you may ask your question in my mail ID I have provided in the first slide. Thank you so much.